everyone. I'm hoping everyone's doing well. This is part 2 of my 3-part series for Metro on copyright basics. The first one, we studied a bit about, what is and isn't copyrightable, what are exclusive rights, copyright duration and the public domain, and a little bit about international treaties. So what I'm going to do today is talk about exceptions and limitations in copyright law. Again, my name is Kiowa Hammonds, and I am the manager of rights clearance at the New York Public Library. Today, we are going to speak about exceptions and limitations in U.S. copyright law. That's going to include first sale doctrine, which is under Section 109 of U.S. copyright law, library exceptions under Code 108, which are specific to libraries, fair use, which is under 107, a little bit about Orphan Works and right of publicity, and a brief introduction to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or the DMCA. So a lot to talk about. And just to say that in part 3, I'm going to focus on licensing for libraries, publishing and licensing agreements, ebooks, things like that, the benefits of registering your work with the U.S. Copyright Office, and ways to minimize risk with your own use of third-party materials. So that'll be in part 3 of this series. Before we get started, I need to make a little disclaimer here. Nothing you hear today should be construed as legal advice. This information is given for legal education only. It may not work for your specific situation. And if you'd like legal advice for your specific situation, please engage in legal counsel. Nothing myself, the presenter, says today should be attributed to a particular client. With that said, let's get started. So although a copyright holder has exclusive rights granted to their work, these rights are subject to some exceptions and limitations in U.S. copyright law. This means that users can use copyrighted work in some situations without prior permission from a rights holder. Now, going back to part 1 of my series, when we talked about exclusive rights under Section 106 and 107, a rights holder has exclusive rights to reproduce the copyrighted work, the right to prepare derivative works based upon that original work, the right to distribute copies to the public, as well as the right to publicly display or perform the copyrighted work in public. But if you think about it, if a rights holder could stop all distribution of their works, then a place like the Strand Bookstore would be infringing thousands of copyrights every day by selling used books. There needs, therefore, to be exceptions in order to promote commerce as well as to incentivize new creative works. A copyright owner has the right to distribute that work, but once sold, the copyright owner has exercised that right and cannot put downstream restrictions on the sale of that copy using their copyright protections and exclusive rights. In other words, copyright law can govern the first sale of a copy of a copyrighted work, but not subsequent sales of that same copy. So what this is called, aptly named, is the first sale doctrine, and I'll read it here. The owner of a particular copy or phonorecord lawfully made under this title or any person authorized by such owner is entitled without the authority of the copyright owner to sell or otherwise dispose of the possession of that copy or phonorecord. Again, this is first sale doctrine is in Section 109A of U.S. copyright law. It creates a basic exception, again, to the copyright holder's distribution right, which allows booksellers to sell used books, as well as loaning institutions like public libraries the ability to lend books, the same copies of the books that they're purchasing. So the first sale doctrine was recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States in a 1908 case, Bobbs-Merrill Company v. Strauss, and subsequently codified in the Copyright Act of 1908. So the publisher, Bobbs-Merrill, had inserted notices in their book titled The Castaway. You can see on this slide here the actual notice that they put in the book, which I'll read here. The price of this book at retail is $1 net. No dealer is licensed to sell it at a less price, and a sale at a less price will be treated as an infringement of the copyright. The defendants, Strauss, who owned Macy's department store, disregarded the notice and sold the books at a lower price without the publisher's consent. The Supreme Court held that the exclusive statutory right to vend, or to be a vendor to sell, applied only to the first sale of the copyright work. So the idea here being that although a copyright holder has exclusive right to multiply and sell their works, they should not also be able to create a right to limit resale of that work. Let's talk about Section 108 of U.S. copyright law. Section 108 was enacted in the 1976 Act and offered some exceptions to libraries and archives to reproduce and distribute certain copyrighted works without permission on a limited basis for the purposes of preservation, replacement, or research. Now, it's through this exception that libraries and interlibrary loan services are allowed to make and distribute photocopies for patrons, and physical or digital copies of the materials can be made for preservation purposes or as a replacement copy. That second part for digital preservation also loops in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which I'll get a little bit into later on. So again, these allowances are a contingent upon a number of conditions. Well, to be honest, several conditions, which I will go through with you now. A participating library must be open to the public or accessible to non-affiliated researchers working in a specialized field. Only a single copy can be made. The copies must be made without any purpose of direct or indirect commercial advantage. Any copy must include either the copyright notice found on the original item, or if there's no copyright notice on the item, then a general legend stating that the work might be protected under copyright. Charges for copying must not exceed the base cost for copying and labor. A notice must be included with the copy stating that, and this is not an exact quote, but something similar to this quote here, this work may be protected by copyright under Title 17 U.S. Code. And there's more. Libraries should not make the copy if they suspect that the item will be used for commercial purposes, excluding the exception. Multiple copies to the same patron should not be made, nor copies of different parts to the same patron in a short amount of time, meaning you send one patron chapter 1 of a book on Monday and would send the same patron chapter 2 of the same book on Tuesday. For excerpts, the reproduction should not be more than one article or a small part of the copyrighted work. And for out-of-print works, a reproduction of the entire work can be made if it's established that a copy cannot be obtained at a fair price from other places. So it's a lot to get into there on the exceptions that make this work for libraries, but I'm happy to go into more detail later on. So it is important to note that these exceptions do not currently extend to musical, pictorial, graphic, or sculptural works, or a motion picture or other audiovisual work other than an audiovisual work that's dealing specifically with the news, so a news program or something like that. When talking about preservation of materials for libraries, libraries are allowed to make up to 3 copies of unpublished works for preservation and security, and may also deposit a copy in another eligible library or archive for research use. This provision came out of the need for 3 copies for microfilm: the camera negative, the print master, and a service copy. Also, 3 preservation copies of a published work can be made by a library if the current item in their collection is damaged, deteriorating, lost, stolen, or in an obsolete format. So Section 108 has served as a great boon for lending institutions, but is certainly not perfect and is overdue for revisions. For one thing, most of its exceptions deal with physical materials, and as our world becomes more digital, these exceptions need to evolve better to address digital files and the internet. Also, 108 does not address important materials such as music and pictorial works, which are seriously limiting the types of research materials we can offer our patrons. And 108 is limited to libraries and archives specifically, so it doesn't extend to cultural institutions like museums, which would benefit greatly from some of these exceptions, particularly when considering preservation purposes. Now, fortunately, the U.S. Copyright Office has in the last few years been reassessing 108, and hopefully we'll be seeing further revisions in the near future. 108 leaves some parts of the exception allotted to libraries up in the air. They're very vague. One in particular is just how much is too much when copying an article or excerpt, and what is the amount of money that makes up a fair or reasonable price. So how does a library determine what falls under the exception? One set of guidelines can be found from the National Commission on new technological uses of copyrighted works, or CON2. CON2 was established to clarify some of the ambiguities of Section 108, particularly guidelines for the amount of items that may be copied under interlibrary loan services and doc delivery. CON2 also tries to clear up the ambiguity for copying materials from digital databases and e-reserves, which are often licensed by third-party companies and not part of a library's direct collection of physical materials. This takes out of the protections allotted under the first sale doctrine, since these databases are licensed rather than a physical copy purchased. Now, CON2 was appointed by Congress in 1976 to establish their guidelines for, and I quote, minimum standards for educational fair use. And this was also under the 1976 Act. However, it is important to note that CON2 is not part of U.S. copyright law. So these guidelines are not set with legislative backing. They are just guidelines to follow within the consortium. So to get a little detail on what CON2's guidelines are, CON2 subscribes to a rule of 5, which is a requirement that libraries should pay publishers' fees if more than 5 interlibrary loan requests are filled within the past 5 years from a specific publications. Libraries should pay publishers' fees if more than 5 interlibrary loan requests are filled within the past 5 years from a specific publication. All interlibrary loan requests must be accompanied by a copyright compliance statement from the requesting library. The requesting library also must maintain records of all requests and of their fulfillment. And these requests must be kept for a term of up to 3 years. Now, no more than 6 copies of articles, chapters, or small portions may be made from a non-periodical, including a book, during the term of its copyright. For copying beyond the CON2 guidelines, the guidelines suggest that the library may need to obtain copyright permission directly from the copyright holder or through representatives such as Copyright Clearance Center. Also, CON2 uses something called ILLiad, which is the Interlibrary Loan Management System, very widely used with academic and circulating library branches, which provides a built-in mechanism for tracking borrowing requests against the guidelines while alerting libraries when that rule of 5 has been exceeded. So it's great for a library to have a working checklist to subscribe to when determining what standards they can do for interlibrary loan and doc delivery. But we should keep in mind that the guidelines are now over 40 years old and are non-binding, again, since they aren't part of legislation. And depending on the math, an institution may end up paying more if a periodical has high demand in 1 year, while others may fall within the rule of 5, even though they're heavily used. And of course, 108's openness can also be a benefit for libraries. Following stringent guidelines like CON2 may actually limit patron access or cause needless restrictions for the library, including the exclusion of fair use, which we'll be getting into in a moment. So it's a bit of grain of salt if your institution wants to follow the full CON2 guidelines or just sections of it. NYPL is actually in line with some of CON2's guidelines, but does not specifically subscribe to the consortium. Perhaps the best known exception that we're all familiar with in copyright law is fair use. Fair use lives in Section 107, Limitations on Exclusive Rights, and fair use was added in the 1976 Copyright Act. And I'll give the definition here. It is brief excerpts of copyright material may, under certain circumstances, be quoted verbatim for purposes such as criticism, news reporting, teaching, and research, without the need for permission or payment from a copyright holder. Now, the determination of fair use by the courts consider 4 main factors, and we're going to go in a bit of detail with these. The first factor is the purpose and characters of your use. Whether the material has been used to help create something new or merely copied verbatim into another work. This is where we get the concept of transformative use. The purpose for using material being to comment upon, criticize, or parody that original copyrighted work. It's also fair use arguments under this factor strongly go broader for encouraging scholarship, research, education, or commentary. A little narrower when we're talking about something that's purely commercial in nature. The second factor is the nature of the copyrighted work. Is the copied work informational or entertaining in nature, say a biography versus a fictional work? Is the copyrighted work published or unpublished? Here again, the scope of fair use is narrower with respect to unpublished works because of the author's right to control the first public appearance of his or her work. The third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion taken. Basically, how much of the original work was actually used. A sentence versus a chapter, a 10-second clip versus a whole film. Also, when considering the amount and substantiality of the portion taken, the court looks not just at the quantity of the material taken, but also the quality. So the analogy I like to use is, are you using a full chapter in a book describing a landscape, or maybe a single sentence or paragraph that reveals the murderer at the end of a murder mystery? What we're talking about here is the heart of the work. Once you reveal that who's the culprit, you can't really go back and necessarily make as much money off that book, or because it's all been revealed. Whereas to use a larger chunk of the book that is not dealing with that crux, you might be able to get away with it. And the fourth factor is the effect of the use upon the potential market. This factor is intended to strike a balance between the benefit that the public will derive if the use is permitted and the personal gain that the copyright owner will receive if the use is denied. Now, this is not to say that just because a derivative work makes money, then it's automatically an infringement. Rather, this factor is weighing the market harm the new work may cause to the money and revenue of the original work. So it's important here, though, to note that the courts consider all four factors collectively in a fair use argument in a ruling. But that said, many times one or two factors may overshadow the others. And also, just because a precedent for a fair use argument may be made from the rulings of a previous case, it doesn't mean that a different court or even the same court may counter the previous argument and rule differently in a subsequent case. So with that in mind, I think the best way to explore how the four factors work is to look at some case examples. So we're going to have a little story time here. Get your popcorn ready. The first case I want to talk about is Carew v. Prince. This was a case heard in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York and later remanded in the U.S. Court of Appeals in 2009. Here, the artist Richard Prince collaged several photographs by Patrick Carew into a series of paintings titled Canal Zone. The photos are of the Rastafarian community in Jamaica from Carew's 2000 photography book, Yes. Now, Prince here argued that the photos were used under fair use, citing the transformative nature of his appropriations of the photographs into his paintings under Factor 1. Now, the district court found the works to be infringing, in part because Richard Prince did not claim to be commenting upon the original works in his new paintings, so therefore it wasn't transformative. Now, under Factor 2, Carew claimed that the photography book was marketed towards artists, and he did present them in galleries, just like Prince's series. Full photos were appropriated by Prince for his work, so that's Factor 3, and his work sold for much higher and were initially believed to harm Carew's own revenue from his photographs. However, the Court of Appeals remanded this ruling, citing that to qualify as a transformative use, Prince's work did not have to comment on the original photographer's work directly. And also, the courts found that market harm was not the case with these appropriations because they may actually encourage more notice of the original photographs. So yeah, there you can see how in the appeals court, even though there was Factor 3 and Factor 2 were not necessarily directly considered in their argument, Factor 1 and Factor 4 really overshadowed in bringing the case on Prince's side there. Another case is Salinger v. Random House. Here, 6 unpublished letters by J.D. Salinger were used in a biography about him without his permission. Now, for Factor 1, the courts found that the letters published served as an important element to the overall biography and therefore served more to capitalize on the first publication of those letters rather than being a critical study or commentary on them. Similarly, for Factor 2, the works were unpublished, and therefore the publishing affected Salinger's exclusive right to publish them later on. Under factor 3, whole letters were used. And under factor 4, again, the publishing of these letters prevented Salinger from publishing themselves or marketing them at a later time. So in that case, the courts ruled in favor of the plaintiff, Salinger. Another case is Universal Studios v. Sony Corp. So this was a U.S. Supreme Court ruling from 1984, and it concerned making individual copies of complete television shows using Betamax VCRs. I'm not sure if anyone out there remembers Beta, but this was the first form of VHS cassette tape, which is also obsolete. So there was a time when cassettes were used to record things. Just there's that. So anyway, that the television shows recorded under Betamax VCRs did not constitute copyright infringement, but were in fact a fair use. So here, under factor 1, a transformative use was shown by the courts through a concept they called time shifting, in which a home viewer was primarily making a recording to watch programs that they already subscribed to, just watching them at a later time, and not with the intent of building up a personal library or selling them to other people. For factor 2, the nature of the programs were in fact there to be watched, and the courts believed that time shifting did not really affect the watching. Just watching them at a later time recorded doesn't make much difference since they were originally broadcasted to be watched. For factor 3, although full programs were recorded, that was necessary to get any use out of the recordings. And under factor 4, because the recordings were primarily for home use, they were considered not to affect the market for the original broadcast. With that in mind, I'd like to give a little extra time to what I consider the classic example of all 4 factors of fair use playing into a case. This is the case Campbell v. Acroft Rose Music, Inc., and this was a fair use case heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1994. In this case, the rap group 2 Live Crew were unable to secure permission from the Roy Orbison estate to use portions of the song Oh Pretty Woman for their parody of the song Pretty Woman. So they went ahead anyway with releasing their song and were subsequently sued by the Roy Orbison estate. Both songs are available, I believe, on YouTube online, so I think you can hear them there. Just to get a sense of how similar both songs are, they use both the backbeat, melody line, and there's obviously some appropriation and play with the lyrics. Also, for any old school rap fan, it's just always lovely to hear some record scratching in a rap song. Kind of rare these days. So in this case, the court found that the 2 Live Crew song was indeed a parody and therefore was a justified transformative use. Now, considering the nature of the copyrighted work, the court found that it had little bearing in resolving the cases of direct parody, since the artistic value of parodies is often found in their ability to invariably copy the popular work of the past in order to comment or make fun of it. Now, regarding the amount and substantiality of the use, it was significant. But the courts reasoned that the portion used was indeed reasonable in relation to the band's purpose of creating a parody. Here, the use of the heart of the original was indeed necessary to conjure the song that they intended to take aim at. In terms of the possible market harm, the Supreme Court found that parodies in general rarely substitute for the original work, since the 2 works serve different market functions. They recognized that the market for rap music, as opposed to rock music, would not affect one another directly. And if they did, they may actually bring profitable sales to both with the marketing of the original song and its parody. So, a Roy Orbison fan might hear that there's this rap song that makes fun of it and go up by the 2 Live Crew version. Also, someone who's a fan of 2 Live Crew might be curious enough to want to hear the original Roy Orbison song. So there you can see all 4 of the factors kind of playing in tandem with each other there in this court ruling. So I would like to briefly talk about 2 more fair use cases. I'm sorry if you've run out of your popcorn, but if there's time, grab a quick refill. This will only take a moment. But I think that these 2 cases are really important because they directly affect libraries. These are 2 fair use cases I'm speaking of now. The first is Authors Guild v. Google, which was a copyright case heard in the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York between 2005 and 2015. The case concerned concerned fair use in copyright law and the transformation of printed copyrighted books into an online searchable database through scanning and digitizations. The case centered on the legality of the Google Books Search project, which was a library partnered project that began in 2003. Basically, Google partnered with a number of different libraries to scan and digitize their collections of books to put into this database, which for some of the institutions included in copyright works. Now, the case went through a few failed settlement attempts, 2 district court cases, an appeal, and a botched attempt by the Authors Guild to have the Supreme Court weigh in. I'd like to give a quote from the appeals court, which sums what I think is best about the fair use argument with this decree. Quote, Google's unauthorized digitizing of copyrighted protected works, creation of a search functionality, and display of snippets from those works are non-infringing fair uses. The purpose of the copying is highly transformative, the public display of the text is limited, and the revelations do not provide a significant market substitute for the protected aspects of the original. Google's commercial nature and profit motivation do not justify a denial of fair use. Google's provision of digitizing these copies to the libraries that supplied the books were also under the understanding that the libraries would use their copies in a manner consistent with copyright law, so the courts found that that was also not an infringement. Now, the other case I want to speak briefly about is Authors Guild v. Hathi Trust. This was a directly related case that challenged the libraries more directly for the copies of the scans that they acquired from the Google Book Search project. Hathi Trust, or Hathi Trust Digital Library, was founded in 2008 by the Committee on Institutional Cooperation and the University of California System. Its purpose being to store copies of the digital content made for the Google Books project that were given to participating libraries. Besides long-term preservation, Hathi allows libraries to receive a digital copy of their collection materials under 108 provisions, again, damaged, lost, or stolen materials. It offers search functionality of these files, single-page viewing of the books, and access to full copies for researchers with print disabilities. This case was also held in the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of New York in 2012. Here, fair use was also argued. Under the 4 factors, the court determined that because search engines had been previously ruled to be transformative in Authors Guild v. Google, and since Hathi Trust included functionality for print disabled users, that the use was very much transformative. Because of the transformative nature of Hathi's copies, this also fulfilled the nature factor, factor 2. Similar to the Google case, although full copies were made of the uncopyrighted material, they were given limited display to the public. And like the Google case, the courts believed that there was no market harm in Hathi's use of the scans through their database that would affect the market for the original books. Although a lot of these cases had happy endings for fair use fans, one has to consider the amount of time and money that went into these cases. This capital isn't something that institutions like libraries often have to argue fair use in the courts. So I'd like to stress that the decisions of the court on copyright cases involving fair use can indeed change drastically between cases and often sway the way cultural institutions will go when assessing risk for using materials. Now, there have been attempts at creating guidelines for libraries to formalize fair use of collections, including some aspects of CONTU, which we discussed previously, but none have been officially granted the force of law. In the 1990s, for example, the Conference on Fair Use, or CONFU, not to be mixed with CONTU, they really should have switched those acronyms better, but anyway, CONFU attempted at building guidelines, but failed. This was in part to the challenges of creating standards for something like fair use, which relies on the specific factors thought through in an individual case. Also, guidelines establish a perception of the maximum use of the materials allowed, when in theory, an institution may have ground to go beyond those guidances in their particular case, but may be afraid of the repercussions. All that said, through examination of case law and trial and error, institutions have become more empowered to use fair use in the digital age, And I'll be addressing some of that in some of the digitization projects we'll talk about in part 3 of my presentation. So stay tuned. So with fair use in mind, we should also take a moment to talk about orphan works. An orphan work is a copyrighted work whose owner is impossible to identify or contact. These works may or may not be in the public domain. It's important here to note that even though work may not have a reachable rights holder, that doesn't mean that it's in the public domain or free to use carte blanche. In order to use the work, a fair use argument or a risk assessment may need to be applied for the institution's use in case a rights holder comes forth and demands compensation for your use. This also extends to things like found footage, a video or a scrapbook you might find at a thrift store or somewhere else like that. If there's creative content there, just because it's not credited or you can't find a rights holder does not change the fact that it may be in copyright. Similar to this is what we call right of publicity, right of privacy. Unfortunately, we could do a whole episode on right of publicity and right of privacy, but in a nutshell, right of publicity is a state legislated law, which means that each state has different terms for right of publicity protections. And mainly these are protections of the name, his or her name, likeness, and persona. This usually applies to more like celebrities, but it could apply to anyone who would make the claim. Again, each state has different terms. So California, for example, has one of the longest terms. That's life of the celebrity plus 70 years. The reason for that, of course, being Hollywood, while some other states have much shorter or don't have protections after death. So today I'd like to end by talking a bit about an important piece of copyright legislation that includes exceptions for digital content, specifically for websites, web users, and institutions like libraries and archives that collect specifically audio and moving image materials. This is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which was signed into copyright law in 1998 by President Bill Clinton. The need for copyright law to acknowledge advancements in technology can be traced really far back as 1908, with the advent of some analog technologies like pianola, recorder, and the original phonographs were invented. But now that we are in the digital age, we have a bit more complicated things to think about. So Congress designed the DMCA in 1998 to give rights holders, service providers, and users updated policies to help bridge the gap between copyright and the internet. The DMCA contains 3 specific sections in the law. Section 1201, which is the anti-circumvention provision. This discourages copyright pirates from breaking DRM or other content access restrictions for, say, a DVD copy, video, DVD, or CD, which has built-in code protections. Section 1202 makes it unlawful to provide or distribute false copyright management information, such as CMI, with the intent to induce or conceal an infringement. And Section 512 is the safe harbor provision, which protects service providers who meet certain conditions from monetary damages for the infringing activities of their users and other third parties on the internet. This is how sites like YouTube can host content that may be infringing without risking liability for that content. Now, in order for a site like YouTube to do that, they are required, when they are given notice of an infringing video, or they have crawlers that automatically find something that they consider infringing, they issue what's called a notice and takedown, which is an automatic service that will give warning and take down the infringing content. So libraries and archives also have exceptions within DMCA to help protect the digitization of their audio and moving image materials. For one, DMCA exempts any carrier or OSP of digital information, which includes libraries, from copyright liability because of the content of a transmission made by a user or service provider that may include infringing content. So basically, if a library user downloads or uses infringing digital content from a library computer system, it's not the library that's on the hook for that. DMCA also updates the current preservation provisions under Section 108. So this includes permitting authorized institutions to make up to 3 digital preservation copies for an eligible copyright work. You may recall that is really exactly in line with 108. Which originally didn't speak to digital surrogates. The DMCA corrected that. Again, I think I say this every time or multiple times in these presentations, the DMCA, 108, all these things, they're not perfect. Many have argued that DMCAs, particularly the provision in 512 of takedown notices, circumvents fair use, which it could be a problem. Also that DMCA, which is over 20 years old now, is already outdated and we need revisions to get us into the 21st century. So there are a lot of criticisms about it, but like a lot of pieces of copyright law, there's always the hope that there will be revisions in the future. With that, I am concluding part 2 of my discussion. Please tune in next month for part 3, where again, we'll be discussing licensing for libraries, digitization and open access, and minimizing potential risk. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.